Hi everyone, this is Dr. Crystal Lee of LA Concierge Psychologist, and I'm going to be doing a brief training on how to create a living agreement. So for those of you who don't know who I am, I'm a clinical psychologist out in Los Angeles, California, and I work primarily with parents of teens and emerging adults or the teens and emerging adults themselves. And really my focus is helping them transition to full-fledged adulthood. So I work a lot with individuals with anxiety, depression, and then I have a specialty in neurodevelopmental disorders, so autism spectrum disorder, ADHD, and LD. So today's training is going to be in three parts. So part one, what is a living agreement even? Part two, setting boundaries, and then part three, actually creating the living agreement itself. So some people ask me, why even bother having a living agreement? It feels so, I don't know, so much like a business transaction, and that's not really how families work, right? So really, a living agreement is really important because it helps keep the peace at home. It keeps everybody on the same page. I mean, the worst situation is where you have parents thinking one thing and having one set of rules, and then the emerging adult living at home really not understanding that and having a completely different understanding of what's happening and what's expected of them. That's really just a recipe for disaster. So what is a living agreement? Well, like it sounds, it's an agreement about the rules of living together. So parents living with their now adult child, still living in the same home. And it really sets the tone for a different kind of relationship where it's not parent and child as much anymore, but adults living together and agreeing upon certain rules for sharing the space. So I'll take you through the finer points later in the presentation, but generally speaking, you're going to be looking at, privileges and boundaries and consequences of not really sticking to those privileges and boundaries. So before we even start writing the actual living agreement document, you really want to think about what are the boundaries that you're looking to set. So one big consideration is thinking about how long do you want to have this living arrangement? There needs to be a time limit because I'm guessing you don't want your emerging adult or young adult living at home forever. So is this arrangement going to be for 6 months? Is it going to be a year and a half, 2 years, shorter, maybe just a month, 2 months, 3 months? It's really up to you because in a way, you're kind of like the landlord for your now emerging or young adult child. Another important consideration is privacy. So not even just for yourself, but also for your emerging or young adult child. Now that they're no longer a minor, there is some expectation of privacy. They're their own person and they need to have some private space. So it's important to think about what you're willing to kind of be more lenient on and what things are non-negotiable. Like if you consider or if you suspect that they're using illicit drugs or something like that, then you can make it clear that there's no consideration for privacy in those cases. But if they're just drinking, now that they're 21, that's okay. Or you won't go into their room if they're not in there and kind of rifle through their things. And similarly, they should keep out of your space too. And when you think about living with your new roommate, definitely consider noise in quiet hours. So almost like when your kids were in the dorms, if they went to college, they had to negotiate with their roommate, when are we going to be lights out? When do you stop playing loud music? Those kinds of things. And it's important to let them know up front what those kind of expected quiet hours are going to be, or when they can have people over and how much noise is tolerable and all of that, because it really can become a point of contention. I alluded to this in my previous slide. You want to think about your guest policy. So When can people come over? How many people can come over at a time? Are they allowed to throw small get-togethers in the home? Even though you're probably the one paying the mortgage and your child may or may not be paying rent, it is their home and you don't want them to feel like a stranger or a continual guest in the home. You want to feel like this is also their home as well, and you're just setting some ground rules. You also want to think about shared resources, so things like groceries or cleaning supplies, toilet paper, the utilities for the house. These are all things that they're really going to have to think about when they're out in the real world, so they should think about it when they're still in your family home. This is probably the area that drives parents the most bonkers. So responsibilities and chores. So who is in charge of doing what chores? How are they going to be pitching in? Is there an expectation for them to do X, Y, Z? Really think about what you're wanting them to do and what's non-negotiable for you, or else you might find that your child is kind of in tween mode and they're sitting on the couch and expecting you to do all the vacuuming and laundry and things like that. And lastly, you really want to think about financial contributions. So is your emerging or young adult going to be paying rent? Even if it's not like a true rent, like $1,500 or something, is it $50, $100, $200, something like that? Are they going to be helping paying for utilities? Are they expected to pay for their own cell phone bill if they haven't already? Are they contributing to groceries and things like that? And sometimes parents feel a little sheepish taking money from their child, especially if their child doesn't actually have a lot of money coming in, like they have a part-time job but it doesn't pay that well. So something nice that some parents have done before is they'll actually take that rent money or utilities money, they'll put it in a separate account for their child, and then when their child moves out, they give the money back to the child and it goes towards like first or last month's rent. So that's something you can think about also. Okay, so now that you've thought about all the different areas that you might want to think about and set some boundaries around, it's time to actually create the living agreement. So I have 5 basic principles that I want people to keep in mind when they go into this process of creating a living agreement. And it really is a process. It's not something that the parents write on their own, present to their child, and then that's it. It should be a conversation, a discussion that both sides are having with one another, because if your child isn't really in agreement or doesn't feel like they're being heard, or you don't even care to understand their position, then there's going to be a lot of resentment and they're probably just not going to follow it, honestly. So the first principle is to be respectful during the process. So inevitably, there are going to be disagreements. Your emerging adult or young adult is not going to think about things the same way that you are, and you're not going to think about things the same way they are, and that's okay. But as long as everyone goes into the process really keeping in mind being respectful, really approaching things with curiosity and without judgment, and really asking questions in order to understand the other side, then the process will go so much more smoothly. So principle number 2 is really kind of the crux of making the living agreement, and it's that all privilege comes with responsibility, and I'll explain what this means. So if you think about the living agreement being in 3 parts, there's the privilege that your emerging adult or young adult is getting, there's your boundary or the expectation, and then there's a consequence for if that boundary isn't upheld. So if we use this basic kind of example, so say the privilege is you're going to cook your emerging or young adult dinner each night. That's just something you're going to provide them. The boundary is, or the responsibility is, your child should be washing their dishes from that meal and any other dishes that they're using within 24 hours after they use them. That's the expectation. And then the consequence is, if they don't do that, you're just not going to make them dinner anymore. So Here's another example. So the privilege is that your emerging adult is going to have some certain room privacy. So parents are only going to enter the room if their door is already open. So if the door is closed, you're going to respect that boundary that, you don't go in. And the responsibility or the expectation is then that your child is going to pay rent. They're going to pay you $100 of rent each month. That's the kind of boundary or expectation for that privilege of them having certain privacy. And the consequence is if the parents go into the room when the door is closed and doesn't knock or whatever, then the parents will actually reimburse the child $5 of rent per violation. So you see this goes both ways. So it's not just consequences for your emerging adults, there's also consequences for parents if they don't follow through. So principle number 3 is a biggie. Pick and choose your battles. So if you think about all those different areas we talked about where you want to set boundaries or consider setting some boundaries or expectations, you could probably come up with 30, 50 things you want to put into this living agreement. If you do that, it's going to be incredibly overwhelming, really difficult to keep track of, and probably hard to enforce because there's just so many parts that you need to be thinking of constantly. So really you want to pick maybe like, I don't know, 7 to 10 absolute non-negotiables, and you can come back and revise the living agreement later on, but really just start with a foundation, the things that you absolutely can't live without, and then 3 months down the line, if things are going smoothly, then add a few other things on there. But if you put everything on there at once, I guarantee you your emerging or young adult is just going to be so overwhelmed, and they're probably going to feel like they're in a gilded cage in some ways and just really, really unhappy. So try to be reasonable, pick and choose your battles. Principle number 4 is having realistic expectations and consequences. So this is a biggie too. I think I'm saying this about everyone. They're all very important, I guess. But if you don't have realistic expectations, then your emerging or young adult, they're just going to fail. There's no way that they're going to be able to do it. So for example, say you really want rent from them and you want a full $1,500 because that's how much rent is in the real world and they need to learn what rent is, what it's like to pay rent in the real world. That's all fine and dandy, but if they don't have a job, then it's going to be impossible for them to pay that $1,500, and then what does that leave them feeling like? It's just helpless. They're going to feel completely helpless. Or if you set a consequence that isn't realistic, for example, if they stop paying rent, you're going to kick them out of the house. Now, that sounds good in theory, but when it comes right down to it, are you actually going to kick them out of the house? Is that realistic for you to enforce? For a lot of parents, it's not, because they can't imagine having their child on the streets. So pick a more realistic consequence for you to enforce, not something lofty that is not going to come to be. Because if push comes to shove, they don't pay their rent, and the consequence is you throw them out of the house and you don't, then your emerging adult is going to look at these other consequences and think, oh, maybe my parents aren't going to enforce this, and maybe I can do whatever I want or not follow all the rules and boundaries and expectations. And that is the last thing that you want. The final principle that I want you to keep in mind is sticking to the plan. So once the living agreement is all discussed and written out and people have signed it, you really want to actually follow through and stick to the plan. So if boundaries are crossed, then you need to actually enforce the consequences. And the privileges need to be given. You can't have these expectations and boundaries without the privileges, or everything kind of just falls apart. So what some parents have done or they'll like post the living agreement in some common areas of the house. So like there might be one on the fridge or something, and then their kid keeps one in their room or on the door of their room or something like that. Um, and just know that the living agreement only works if you actually stick to it. So once things start getting a little free flowy, blurred, then it's just not going to work. And of course, that doesn't mean be super, super rigid and don't have a heart, or, don't make exceptions when you think exceptions are needed, but really be mindful. If you're not following the living agreement, make sure it's not out of convenience, or being tired, or whatever, but make sure that you're actually intentionally not doing something or adjusting something because of life. All right, so that's the end of my quickie training on how to make a living agreement. If you think that you might need some more assistance in making one, if you're in California, I can work with you via teletherapy, which is secure video conference. Or if you're on the west side of Los Angeles, I actually do in-home sessions. So I'm able to help in that way. If you're outside of California, unfortunately, I'm not available to help within the capacity of a psychologist, but if you drop me some comments or something like that, I can try and answer any additional questions you guys might have. All right, thanks for watching.